thank you everybody for joining us this evening. This is our first event since the summer break. So we're very excited to be discussing this subject. Many people have said to me that it's actually quite pertinent, even though this was planned several months ago. Obviously, lots has happened in the last few months that I guess raised the importance of this issue. So I'm Anaya. I run events at Civic Future, and for those, I'm sure many people know about Civic Future, but I will just give a very abridged introduction. So Civic Future identifies and trains the next generation of public leaders in the big moral, technological, and governance questions of our time. We have a fellowship for early to mid-career young people interested in a future in running institutions, building great organizations, and making a positive impact on society. And we're in our second intake of our fellows. We're founded in late 2022. We have an annual conference. We had one in July, which was on geopolitical instability. Our first one was on economic stagnation. So they're all on the big global technological political questions, and a whole range of other things we do. Host discussions like this one, informing public debate, bringing different types of people together in public and private events, and also run courses on economics and all sorts. So if you don't know about Civic Future, please check out our website and find out more about the work that we do and spread the message. So we are talking about petty crime and antisocial behaviour. There's been many statistics that many of you might have seen in the news that it has increased substantially over the last few years. That, for example, many crimes have almost been de facto legalised in the sense that police aren't prosecuting or convicting people. And there's even been people saying that was one of the least discussed, but actually one of the most important issues for the public in the election. This sense that not just things aren't working, but the kind of social fabric is fraying, and that there is not this sense that actually if you go to the police or that something will be done, but also this sense of neighbourliness, that people are just not really caring about the community and the relationships and bonds that make people feel like they're part of a wider society. So we've brought together a panel from lots of different perspectives to hopefully try and understand and shed some light on this important question, and hopefully also get closer to what we can do about it. The Labour Party have said that this is actually one of their major priorities, and so that's a good opportunity to actually inform some of the discussion. So how this is going to go, each speaker is going to give just some opening provocations. I might just ask a question to each speaker, but we'd really like to hear from the floor. I know that there's lots of people here that have a specific interest or expertise in this area, so we'd really like to have quite a broad discussion, bringing in lots of different perspectives. So I'm just going to introduce the panel, and then we will crack on. So our first panelist is Tom McNeil. He's the chair of the Criminal Justice Alliance, CEO of JABS Foundation, and I'm sure he might talk about that a little bit more, and former Assistant Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands. And we also have Lisa McKenzie. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Bedfordshire and author of Getting By, Estates, Class and Culture in Austerity Britain. And we also have over here Rory Gorgon.
Gagan. I'll use the opportunity to broadcast it to the world, and I hope that it's never mispronounced again. But no, super to be here.
Founder of the Public Safety Foundation, former police officer, and he was a special advisor for Justice and Home Affairs at number 10 Downing Street between 2020 and 2022. And we also have Andrew Kemp, CEO of LitterCam, a tech company that uses AI to identify and report vehicle littering. So that's another element of discussion we want to get into, the role of artificial intelligence technology in potentially resolving these challenges. So Rory, I'd like to start with you in terms of your opening thoughts on the subject.
Well, look, firstly, thank you for having this debate in the first place. I think it's a really important subject. I don't think it gets quite enough sort of thoughtful discussion with different perspectives, so I'm really excited to be here. Less delighted at being the first speaker because I'd sort of assumed I'd be later on, but I'll roll with it. So I suppose the thing I'm keen to kind of reinforce today is to try and pare back some of the sort of, unique to this moment sort of factors, and just sort of go back to sort of first principles as to kind of, why is crime, I won't use the word petty, that's a whole other subject, but, crime and antisocial behaviour, why is it on the rise? Why could it be on the rise? Why is it as high as it is? And so I think for me, what I'm keen to bring across is sort of this question of individual agency and personal responsibility, which we don't tend to hear politicians speak much of nowadays. We had a bit of it in the pandemic, where all of a sudden, it was kind of, you need to take personal responsibility and stay at home and so on. That was my best attempt at Boris there. Very poor attempt, but so for me, there's this question of individual agency and personal responsibility, and I think a lot of the discussion around crime and antisocial behaviour often, understandably to some degree, ends up sort of caught up in structural factors, societal factors, and so on. So for me, I'm just kind of going to try and focus a bit on this question of individual agency and personal responsibility. And so for me, with my classic ex-copper kind of hat on, it's this question of, what is the risk of being caught? What is the risk of being caught, and what's the risk of, any potential consequence? It's a rather Benthamite kind of idea, but kind of, pain and pleasure kind of, it's that sort of classic deterrent stuff. So obviously, stop and search in London, at least, is at the lowest level on record. We've obviously got charge rates at some of the lowest levels ever. And we've got out-of-court disposals occasionally, at least, being used in inappropriate circumstances. And so all of that sort of speaks to this issue of people not fearing or not expecting to get caught, which, just based on my walk here this evening, seeing plenty of people cycle through on red lights, people, speeding along and revving their engines very antisocially, speaks to kind of this sort of slight sense of lawlessness, which of course we see play out in the media too. So the first point for me is the risk of being caught is actually much lower than it has been. And even if the risk is higher than, I might have painted, if the perception is that the risk is very low, then people will engage in things that they might not otherwise have done. I think the second piece for me is this question of, kind of back to this individual responsibility, is the police themselves, partly, I don't have enough time to get into it now, but part of, I think, the consequence of austerity, in addition to cuts to numbers, was police trying to make sense of that and trying to figure out how do we make this work with fewer officers. And I think they sort of bought a bit too much into the idea that catching crooks doesn't work. And I think, the risk there is that obviously, in addition to obviously them not doing their jobs, it also then means that they do focus their efforts on crimes of a more serious nature, which reinforces that earlier point I made about the risk of being caught for some of the more less serious offences. And then the next piece for me, youth justice system and the sentencing regime more generally. The number of times I've certainly been to court with people, and sometimes the family members themselves are devastated when the sentence is not what they had hoped. They'd hoped for something more severe. They'd hoped that they had something that would stop them from seeing their friends who are actually a bad influence. And so there's a question, I think, of whether the sentencing regime and the youth justice system in particular permits rather than prevents further offending. And again, back from my own sort of lived experience, if you will, there's young people who are in dire straits who, frankly, we need to grip them. And, you can paint that if you like as me saying we should grip them and, bang them up forever. If you paint that if you want that way. But for me, it's kind of, we're not doing them any favours by allowing them to run loose on the streets and ultimately ending up in custody for something very serious, whether it's homicide, manslaughter, etc. So for me, there's this question of, are we actually permitting or preventing offences in the justice system? The prison system, I think we're all aware, hopefully, that it's been run appallingly for various reasons. There's lots of blame to go around. And actually, as we've seen, we should have been expanding rather than shrinking broadly. And then, of course, there are wider factors, which I'm sure others might delve into. So I'm not deaf to those wider factors. But for me, this question of individual agency and personal responsibility is one that we don't hear enough of. And there was a video on X today of Channel 4, I think, interviewed, I say a young man, he's probably my age, but he came out of prison out of Brixton, and he was saying, I'm coming out, what's the state doing for me? I should be walking into a job, blah, blah, blah. Gone viral, so you might have seen it. And nowhere in the discussion, nowhere in the prison regime, for instance, is there any real attempt to kind of instill personal responsibility, individual agency? It's a very sort of infantilizing environment. So to get to solutions quickly, if I can, and I'm staying high level for the moment, politicians, I think, need to reseed the idea of personal responsibility and individual agency. There's a lot of talk about structural, systemic, etc., etc. But actually, if we're not going to get to individual agency and personal responsibility and how we reinforce that, then the tax burden is only going to increase ever more, and we're going to all be impoverished and unsafe. So for me, politicians need to reseed the ideas, and then we need policy and practice to flow from that. And hopefully I've not gone on too long.
Thank you. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much. I should just say, it happens all the time to me actually, but you did promote me twice then. I'm only a trustee of the Criminal Justice Alliance, not the chair. And I was the Assistant Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands. But the way I like to ham that up is the West Midlands is quite big. So it felt relatively important. Not many people go along with that, but I try my best. I think the one thing about this debate is that there's actually an awful lot more common ground than is kind of given credit for. So most people I speak to from across places like the West Midlands, hugely diverse in a whole load of ways, including economic, certainly ethnic background and loads of different cultural nuances. And I very, very rarely speak to anybody that doesn't want the high levels of crime in their community being stopped. And that's antisocial behaviour, it's shoplifting, it's domestic abuse, it's sexual violence, it's everything, but including the smaller stuff by comparison to the most serious crimes. So people want it stopped. As a general rule, most people I speak to do actually think it would be good to have more police officers, because even if in the longer term they'd like to see a much, much more ambitious investment in prevention and upfront prevention and support for young people, and I'll emphasise that in a moment because that's absolutely where I'm at, they still recognise that right now, police just very often, certainly in a place like the West Midlands, just don't get to all the calls. They don't get to all the domestic abuse calls. They don't get to serious sexual offence calls quickly sometimes, despite knowing how serious it is. They want to be there. They really do. And so there's generally a recognition they at least need to be there to keep people safe. And then I would also acknowledge that when we talk about things like shoplifting, where it's a huge knock-on effect for consumers across the whole country, including very low-income people, because we know costs go up, and there's a huge anxiety and misery caused to shop workers. So it's got to stop. And I think more police and recognising that the police have to be there to prevent and stop crime there when it's happening and respond is important. However, I think the evidence is crystal clear, looked at in many, many different ways, whether it's around the impact of addiction, homelessness, poverty, exploitation, the role of domestic abuse causing trauma, leading to substance misuse and other problems. It depends on each individual, and different groups and cohorts sometimes have more common themes. Younger people might be more likely to be pulled into crime due to exploitation and peer groups and vulnerability. Women typically are often victims of domestic abuse and systemic poverty. And there's a lot of programs for each of those different cohorts that focus on relationships of those individuals, building trust, because trust is often not there, being holistic and tailoring the support to those individuals. If you've got a woman committing crime, victim of domestic abuse, homeless, and all the other things I've mentioned, that needs a really concerted, holistic response. And there's lots of evidence about effective programs. So what I think is we need to be honest about that. Short term, there has to be a police presence because we can't have just lawlessness. But what I would like to see, and I've seen it a bit with West Midlands Police, there's a long way to go in my opinion, but a culture change in policing, which really builds strong referral pathways and relationships with those programs in the community that have an evidence base, which do work to prevent crime and reoffending, and can stop somebody who is causing misery in their community, sometimes for many years. And not only that, sometimes they end up becoming community leaders themselves and leading the change. So it is possible. I think more of it, the police should play a bigger role on it, and there is common ground about wanting it to stop. But I think the emphasis should be more on those holistic support solutions.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Lisa.
Well, thank you for inviting me. When you first invited me, which was quite a while ago, actually, it's probably 6 months ago at least, we were in a very different space than where we are today. So 6 months ago, a year ago, I had a particular sort of idea. I'm a sociologist. I've written books about living on a council estate, because that's where I grew up in Nottingham. I do lots of research with working class people in working class communities. So this is a very relevant subject, probably more relevant actually than it is to any other group, because when you live in a working class community, when you live on a council estate, you are surrounded by what we might call sort of petty criminal acts. You know, there's graffiti, there's rubbish. There's not petty. They're more serious. Drug dealing, the county line stuff. I've lived in an inner city council estate for 20 odd years. I wrote a book about that inner city council estate. And I'm also from a coal mining community. My dad, my granddad, my great-granddad were all coal miners. So I've watched over 40 years these communities that were filled with working class people who were kind of small c conservative, actually. Very connected to community, very connected actually to law and order. You know, the knowing what your neighbours were doing and if they were doing anything wrong that was policing enough. You know, the shame of your son going to prison was massive. And so I've come from those communities, and over 40 years I've seen that break down. And it's particularly things around drug dealing, and then what starts off as petty that then becomes major. And, you know, from petty drug dealing, selling a bit of weed, actually can lead into county lines, drug dealers opening up county lines in places like coal mining communities. I've seen this happen. I've seen 60-year-old men who used to be coal miners, their houses get cuckooed, which is a process of the county lines gangs being sent to an area, mostly children. Those children have been groomed by older drug dealers. They then find a vulnerable person in a community, and then they move in, and then they run the drug dealing from that house. And I remember once being in a coal mining community in Nottinghamshire. I was sat with a man who was 60 years old, and he was smoking crack. And I said, "How long have you been on this?" And he said, "About 2 years." And I thought, how does a 58-year-old man who's an ex-coal miner, who lives in a coal mining community, which is quite remote, how does this happen? And over the years, this has really troubled me. And I'm not on the left as such. I am an anarchist. I'm a free thinker. And it's something that the left don't really like to address. They don't really like to address the absolute horror of what happens when the police retreat and the community is almost retreated as well. Because one of the problems that we have now is people are quite frightened. So they don't want to grass each other up. They don't want to confront their neighbours. And so we've got these sort of fears. And as a working class woman, this is not good enough for working class people, actually. And one of the things actually that has happened in the last 8 weeks, and it's really sort of changed my ideas around this, is the way that petty crime or crime in general is, I suppose, narrated. And when does petty crime become major crime? When does a petty criminal become a major criminal? And then at what point do we have these as political narratives? And over the last few weeks, with the disorder, which has mainly been in the north and actually been in places that have been run down over 40 years, we've had disorder in those places. And it's really been present that throwing stones at police, which may be seen as petty on any other day, swearing at the police, breaking windows, when it becomes political, it becomes major crime. And this is sort of something that I've written about for a long time. We start thinking about two-tier. And in the last couple of years, it's been like a catchphrase, of two-tier systems, two-tier policing, two-tier justice system. But in my experience and in my research, there's always been a two-tier. And it's always been about those who are valuable and their communities which are seen as valuable, and then those who are seen as devalued, people who are not valued in society. And I'm just going to finish now, really. Solutions. One of the things that we have is this sort of constant devaluing of people. These people are inherently bad or thick or stupid or racist or whatever it is politically. That's what we sort of box into these groups of people. So they are seen as and known as not of value, people not of value. So I think that this is an issue that we need to think more about. And rather than sort of, can I give a solution? You know, should we have more police on the street? Should we have more community centres? Should we have more youth centres? I think this is a matter of narrative. And we have to start to think about who is narrated as valuable in society, who is narrated as unvaluable.
Thank you, Lisa. And then we'll finally go to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much indeed. It's great to be with you all this evening. So about 7 years ago, I set up a company to focus on artificial intelligence solutions for just a narrow set of antisocial behaviour to tackle littering. So it costs you and I as taxpayers about £1 billion a year to keep the streets clean. And here in London in 2009, some civil powers were set up for local authorities to enforce against littering from vehicles where the identity of the driver didn't need to be known. And it's a bit of a challenge for local authorities. They had these powers. As I say, there's this huge sum of money being spent annually, and there's no solution to the problem. I live quite rurally in Yorkshire. Used to live on a farm, a late wife, looked after livestock, and there'd be fly tipping placed in gateways, which is an issue both from the cost of removing it, but also if you can't get to the livestock, they can. That's it. It's your livelihood gone, and you've got no animals. So I interviewed all the local authorities across South Yorkshire, Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire, really to understand from their perspective what challenges they were facing to really get the results that they were looking for. And they said it's two things. One, getting evidential quality footage in a reliable and consistent way was really, really difficult. There would be literally teams of people looking at CCTV screens just in case something that may be of interest was apparent. And if they did then see something, there were all these labyrinthine back-end systems that just weren't joined up. So they didn't really have much chance of doing the things that they wanted to do. So I've spent about 20 years in and around the contact centre industry. I don't know if you can remember back in the sort of 90s, if you wanted to contact your bank and you had a particular issue, you'd have to repeat yourself a few times as you get transferred across different departments. I was thinking, well, okay, is there a way of using technology to put the footage in the hands of the people that need it? And then if they did have that information, how could they quickly get the results that they're looking for to really embed behaviour change? So over the past sort of 7 years, we've really focused on creating that technology. Using artificial intelligence, we can automatically identify from CCTV footage the action of littering from vehicles, if litter is present on the ground. So national highways, as they're now called in England, they have a performance indicator to conduct a statutory duty, which is to keep the ground or the roadways with which they're responsible for free and clear of litter. Transport Scotland, they have contracts in place with their service providers that aren't used because they don't have the mechanism to do so. So really, I think there's a role for technology in helping drive service delivery improvements, in helping create more value for the taxpayer. And then I think there's a really important data consideration as part of this. So when new systems and new technologies are being created, who owns that data? Is it these local authority organisations? Is it police? Is it the Transport Scotland or these different service providers? How's that data audited? So can they get a view of which individuals or systems have looked at that data and how long it's been kept? I think these are all really important considerations when any organisation or government is looking at the potential use of technology to reduce crime. So those would be the key sort of things that I think are the most pertinent issues from a technology point of view and what we do as a company.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'm just going to ask a question each, and hopefully, bring some of the different points that have been raised together. I wanted to start off with you, Lisa, because I think that you made a very interesting argument about the way in which certain issues become politicized, and which groups are valued and how those kind of groups are constituted within society. But like, if you look at a lot of the polling, for example, and you kind of touched upon the rise. If you look at a lot of the polling, and of course the polling doesn't illuminate all of the complexities of the issue, but the overwhelming majority of the public, a pretty hard line in terms of their belief in how the rioters should essentially be experiencing the full force of the law, and don't that there seems to be different polls that show different things in terms of how the public views what might be described as other anxieties or other concerns that particular individuals that participated what their rationale was, and so on and so forth. What do you say to that actually ultimately people have agency? If you break the law, if you engage in these kinds of behaviors, that's your responsibility. And we can always kind of bring up various different sociological factors that may or may not have led to things, but that's something that people need to be responsible for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a complete sort of everything is structure and there is no agency, because that sort of belittles people's ability to free think, and again that adds to that narrative that there are people who are just stupid. So of course they have got agency. So, and again, this is the problem I have with the left, is that they sort of go, poor people have got no agency, they don't know what they're doing, they're just very reactive and reactionary, and that's it. So I absolutely know that people have got agency, and I've written quite a lot about the way that, because it's always a question, why do people who are frustrated with the system and angry about politics and have no real political representation? Because let's be honest, if you look in at Parliament or even in your local council, how many of those people actually represent the poorest communities or the most deprived communities? Very few, actually. I mean, in Parliament, I think the number of working class or working class people who've come from a working class background, I think it's something like 7%. It's very low. It's almost like the opposite of. So, if you are feeling frustrated, is it reactionary to become extremely angry? And when you and people have always said, but why do rioters smash up their own communities? Why do they do that? Because why don't they go somewhere else and smash up there? And it is something, as an anarchist, I would say, don't smash up your own community. Go to Westminster, throw stones there. That is my response. But actually, that doesn't happen. And it is something called slow rioting. It's the way that people become unsettled, angry, upset, and sort of distanced, but they do it in their own communities. And so therefore there are symbols that make them angry in those communities. And I think, and this is not any sort of excuse. But I think the hotels that the rioters in over a few weeks ago, I think that when they went for those hotels, I think that was some sort of, it's not an excuse, but it was that they were symbols of something that perhaps they thought was out of their reach. And so that's, one of the things that people do in riots, and when they feel politically absent, is they do smash up their own communities, because where are they going to go?
And Tom, just following on that point, you talked about more policing, and that you think that what you'd like to see is police really engage with communities more deeply through various organizations and so on. But what do you do when trust has been eroded so much that where people that you would hope would be the kinds of people police are engaging with in order to prevent something, escalating, what have you, don't have that sense of trust in policing?
There's so much to say here. It's very difficult to even bring it down to a sensible answer. But I'll start with this. Firstly, my emphasis isn't just on the police engaging with the community, because sometimes there's not a place for that. So there's been a bit of an emphasis on lots of police officers in schools. There is a time and a place for that, and it can be valuable. But if you just throw loads of cops in, and it's a police force that has quite a punitive attitude, that could really build bigger divides, particularly if there's other cultural complexities in the applicable area. So it's not just about the police engaging, but what it is on a very kind of operational level is when there are programs of work which are normally led by communities themselves. Nearly every time when it's good and effective, it's led by communities, but normally as a partnership, because the problems causing crime are multidimensional. So it normally needs a multidimensional approach. It's about making sure the police are docked into those organisations that do a good job. I've seen improvements in trust when actually, rather than just punishing somebody where it's very clear there's a whole list of serious problems for them, they've referred them on to, the Jabs Foundation is for women and girls, so that's where I'll focus, but it doesn't just apply to women and girls. Refer them on to a women's centre. Not every women's centre will be as good as the next, but where they've got a really fantastic reputation for building trust with the women. And actually the police recognising that that was the best place for them rather than a more punitive approach was the thing that rebuilt trust. I suppose I do think we need more policing, but it doesn't mean just loads of aggressive policing and loads of presence in a particular area. It has to be really strategic and worked through, and it has to be using data and technology sometimes to make sure you're placing police in the right place. So, for example, if you've got regular burglary in an area and actually just dedicated police resource to doing all the follow-up work that is needed to actually follow and identify the pattern to catch them, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And it's fascinating when we talk about class and different communities, because in the West Midlands, the majority of the criticisms I've had is particularly from higher Black proportion communities, furious at their belief in over-policing and too much stop and search and use of powers. And so it's fascinating, but you've got multi-sections of communities that either feel they've got too much, not enough. You've got much more traditionally white British working class in the Black country, but far not just white working class. They feel they don't get enough policing. And it's true they don't, because the bulk of the resource is put into Birmingham, which has a massive population and extremely high deprivation stats. So you've got all these things that they're fighting against. What I did just want to do is to jump on a couple of quick points about taking personal responsibility. Again, most people I speak to, even if, they're stereotypically left-wing or whatever, do want people to take responsibility, particularly when we're talking about things like domestic abuse and everything else. And it's why I love things like restorative justice. It's really thought out program of work where it is about the individual really understanding the emotional impact they've had on their victim or victims as a learning journey and a recognition that they did wrong. But that very process, particularly when it's combined with other elements, if you've got somebody who's got an addiction and they're homeless and they've been associated with an organised crime group, a restorative component combined with these other elements over a prolonged period of time, super effective. So it's kind of, again, blending that common ground of things. Final point, there are actually an awful lot of working class MPs. depending on how you define it. But there's a lot of people that didn't come from a high economic background in terms of wealth. A lot of people, certainly in the Labour Party, that's where my knowledge is. I don't know so much about the other parties, proportionate wise, but the vast majority of Labour politicians went to state school, for example. And I mean, I know a lot of MPs, and a lot of them come from, really poor backgrounds. So there is some elitism in the game of politics, no doubt, but it's definitely, just like the police isn't, it's not homogenous, I don't think.
And Andrew, I mean, some people, undoubtedly technology, plays a role in policing in all sorts of ways, but some people might argue that actually that, moving forward with technology in a particular kind of way is almost an acceptance that, we can't really police ourselves societally, that actually we need to bring in technologies, things that don't involve, human beings engaging with one another, because that's lost. We've lost that kind of social trust, and therefore we have to bring in technologies to fill those gaps. I mean, what do you say to that criticism? I mean, do you buy into that at all, or do you not think it's?
I wouldn't agree with that point. So I think Tom touched on some of this. So if there are some complex issues that an individual is facing from their background that is clouding their judgment or their sort of natural tendencies or who they really are, as an example, they may have fallen into some circumstances that, let's say, if they develop drug dependency and they start engaging in theft to fuel a habit, let's say, as an example, then having technology to increase the level of penalism from the law or the force of the law, I don't think is necessarily a good thing. It's been much more effective to really understand what the nature of those issues are and try and give them the support that they need. I think from our perspective, in terms of the technology that we have created, is just to reduce the effort associated with, well, let's say, for example, if there's been a parking offence or somebody's gone the wrong direction down a road, how could that information have been, or how could a system be created that's just going to generate that event and free up those resources to do something that's more human orientated and has got that more personal touch, really?
And just a question for you, Rory, because I'm just, there's lots of deeper issues that have been raised, which I think are important and necessary to talk about. But in terms of what can be done now, I was just talking about, yesterday, I got off the tube. This was like 2 p.m. There was 3 boys about 12 years old that pushed through the barriers. I don't know what their personal situation was, but it was obviously they're not in school at that point. They're wearing, tracksuits, and the train person said, you're not allowed to do that. They just started swearing, insulting the person. And it was very obvious that they knew there was going to be no consequences for their actions. And nobody else said anything, and barely anyone kind of looked up. And it does, again, contribute to this sense that some of the things have been touched upon, that a lot of people don't feel like anything's going to be done. There's no point really intervening because they're not going to be supported. It contributes to the sense of lawlessness. So in that instance, if someone called the police, it's unlikely that they can really do that much in that instance. That it'll be a lot of resources to catch these boys that have just jumped the barriers. What's the solution? I know it's a complex issue, but on that instance, because we're talking about deeper issues, but that's actually like a really concrete example that people are seeing on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've been struck by everyone's comments, and I suppose I learned a lot, probably as Lisa did, sort of, living on an estate and living around people and spending time with people. And I certainly learned a lot, I think, as a neighbourhood police officer in Lambeth, having a little slice of London to take care of, and getting to know the people on the estates and getting to know the people that don't live on the estates. And London is like this sort of complex quilt of, you've got the head of Goldman Sachs in one street, and then the next one over you've got, a kind of couple of crack houses. So I found having the autonomy and having the sort of dedicated focus on a relatively small patch of London, a council ward, And the fact I wasn't being dragged off to police Just Stop Oil, I wasn't being dragged off to do anything other than, I think the only things I got dragged away to do were Notting Hill and New Year's Eve. And otherwise I could pretty much tell anyone to jog on who asked me to do something else, which was brilliant. But I did get to know people. And what I realised early on is that, this question of trust, for instance, even then trust in policing was a constant thing in the press. But what I found on the estates often was, yes, you had some people who were really vehement, beyond almost redemption, if you will, by my interaction, certainly, distrusting and in some cases hateful of the police. There were a lot of people who voiced similar messages to me in public or when their peers or the neighbourhood were out. But then privately, they'd catch me in a stairwell and they'd be egging me on. They'd be saying, thank God you're here, keep on it, bum, bum, bum. You shouldn't be on here on your own. You shouldn't be on here without a gun. You shouldn't be on here without a taser. And for me, as I saw it, these people relied upon me, right? I was filling a void in the sort of agency question, right? So, who is going to intervene in a problem? Can we expect ordinary members of the public to jump into some sort of knife fight? Can we realistically expect that? Can we even expect them to get involved on a train if there's an altercation? And certainly I think there's enough viral videos and social media to put people off doing those things. But certainly as a police officer, I've therefore felt like if I walk past something that is going on that shouldn't be, then I'm permitting it and I'm promoting it. And so for me, and some colleagues would obviously probably snigger about it, but for me, if I saw a young lad drop litter on the estate, I'd be on him like you wouldn't believe. And then the crowd would come out and go, oh, leave him alone, he ain't done nothing and all that. And then eventually a voice would pop up because I'd been there a while. Oh no, leave it out, Rory's all right. Mm. And all of a sudden he would correct and he would go, oh my God, it's not just the pig who's after me, it's actually my community. And so for me, it's not a solution to the train issue. You mentioned the ticket barrier jumping, but for me, we really do and have overlooked, I think, the importance of having dedicated officers covering specific areas with tenure and with the autonomy to address the issues that are troubling that neighbourhood. So for me, that's one thing. Obviously, in terms of the fare jumping, I mean, there's a role here probably for AI and tech. I mean, I'd probably challenge a bit the idea that, for example, if we could identify London's most prolific shoplifters using AI and come up with our top 1,000 shoplifters, there would be value in that. Because those people will almost certainly either be organised criminals or being exploited by or otherwise engaged with, or they'll be addicted to crack and heroin. And we spend a lot on drug treatment, and we should be getting those people into that process and into recovery, ideally. So I think there is a role for tech, and I think, not to sound too old-fashioned, but I do think, the traditional copper that has a patch, and we recognise that and value that, so that they don't just, go there and then they never get any courses, they never get any development, I think is just really important.
Okay, I've got more questions, but I want to bring it out to the floor if other people might have some thoughts, challenge, put different perspective forwards, statements, questions, all of that is fine. I'll grab.
Is that all right? Yeah. Thank you for that. Really, really interesting talk. Lots of you have spoken about sort of culture and social norms. And you mentioned, Rory and Lisa, about sort of communities and things like that. So I just wondered, what is it you'd like to see political leaders do to shape those norms and shape that culture when sort of, at least my instinct is that initiatives from the centre can often be the very thing that undermines the agency that you've been talking about as being the thing that's either been lost or that we want to build up?
Yeah, we'll go.
I mean, I don't think you can ever underestimate, because although I believe that there is structure and agency and both interconnect, you can never underestimate the way that structural inequality works. So, I mean, I was listening to you talk about restorative justice, and the thing is with this sort of thing, it's very, very expensive. I mean, if you have a community and you have, people you want to do restorative justice, these are expensive. These are things that they don't happen. And my experience of this is when people need the support that they need at that point, that if it's not there to catch them, they fall through. And it's very often it's not there. So the guy that was on Twitter who was saying, you know, I haven't got a job, I've come out of prison, I haven't got a job. Throughout his life, lots of things would have happened, and there would have been points where somebody could have caught him, but that didn't happen. And I think that's part of what I think of this devaluing process. You know, whose lives and who is worth value and whose isn't. And I've got a very strong suspicion that it is cheaper to keep people at the bottom and poor than it is to provide proper services, you know, to tackle inequalities, and you know, just simple things like the housing issues. You know, but how are you going to have a community when, you know, we've got such a broken housing market? When, you know, people, they're renting for 6 months and then having to leave, or council housing isn't being built, and private landlords are in the middle of council estates owning 50 houses. So these are structural issues, and they're big. And too often we can think about the individual, but I think we need to think about the structures.
I was shaking my head, but it was only at the restorative justice bit, because most of what you said I completely agree with. And some of the big solutions are expensive, but the timing thing is massive. It really is only one piece of the jigsaw, but it feels appropriate for the debate today. One of the reasons I keep talking about the police and making sure that interface with effective work is taking place is because that's what makes sure that support is put instantly, because the best work knows exactly what you just said. If you don't get in there quickly, well, that person might be back out that night.
Yeah.
Well, they probably will be, often, you know, to get the next crack hit or whatever else. So it does have to be quick, and there are ways of doing it. The more expensive stuff is the housing bit. And that's why it's really good to talk about crime in multiple layers. I'm all down for talking about personal responsibility as well, and tech as well. And then if you don't have a home and you're in desperation and you're really angry with society, you are at risk of being the worst version of yourself. Just to answer your question, again, there's so many things I could say. One of the things that I think is really profound, but sometimes I don't say it because it almost sounds too simple and like I'm a bit embarrassing for proposing it. But I do think widespread investment in sports and arts defined broadly, you know, to meet what people want to do, modern age or otherwise, for young people, would just play such a massive part in rebuilding social fabric. When you've got something that you're good at or you enjoy and you're there regularly, you're not somewhere where there's trouble, you're doing something you love, particularly if you discover a talent, but it doesn't always have to be a talent, it can be transformative. And it sounds a bit kind of twee, doesn't it, sometimes when you're talking about crime, but that's some of the kind of community investment that I think would make a radical difference, but it rarely gets taken seriously in debates. When I say it, it's just kind of brushed over.
I would take that seriously, yeah, very seriously.
I think as well on the cultural sort of norms point, I think, so for instance, you know, we've had, I think Keir Starmer held a knife crime summit, I think it was last week now, maybe it was this week, I forget. But, you know, recently he's held a knife crime summit, he's had Idris Elba there, he's had, you know, great and good of various sorts. Well, Theresa May did the same and had a knife crime summit, and, you know, we were all packaged up into different rooms and, you know, not much seemed to happen. And I suppose for me, like, there's an opportunity, I think, for, and I extend this to wider civil society beyond just the politicians, but I would love, for instance, to see Idris Elba or Stormzy or whoever it might be, actually say, do you know what, on stop and search, there is a role for it. There is a role for it. The police won't always get it right. If you're unhappy with how it's going, if you're unhappy about how it's being done, the time to explore that is afterwards. Because, you know, it infuriates me, honestly, to see politicians pretty consistently, with a few exceptions, sort of see stop and search as an easy way of knocking the police and appeasing and or appealing or trying to appeal to certain special interest groups. And so for me, I'd love to see a bit of a push for, actually, you know, the police don't always get it right. They won't always get it right. They never will, just as we're all human. And so on issues like stop and search, or if you're being arrested, or if you're having some interaction, the time for hot tempers and stuff is after. And that won't magically cure the problem, but I think it would go some way towards, I think, taking the sting and some of the excitement out. And then the other piece too, I'd say, which I hopefully have just remembered. So Idris Elba, and then it was to riff off of someone else's point, but it was this sort of cultural norms point. So so for me, for instance, I would say actually to your point about arts and culture, I would be really radical and say, was extending mandatory education to 18 in a classroom most often the right thing to do?
No, you're
Does
right.
that really engage young men in particular? We know their performance is not what we would love it to be. So are we trying to fit a bit of a round peg in a square hole or whatever? We've got a shortage of trades. We've got a dependency on mass immigration. No wonder, arguably, we've sort of clogged up people's lives with education, which isn't in many cases leading to the incomes or the promises perhaps that were offered. So for me, if I had a big old blank canvas, one of the things I would do would be to say, actually, the education system has a lot to answer for, and that does indeed lead me to the norms point, which is, I think, schools and education and discipline. And Michaela obviously is often held up as like, the sort of beacon at one end of things, but I think schools. Oh, there we go, super. So well, I won't say any more, but just to say, I think education has a critical role just in terms of those young people. Why weren't they in school? Why were they? Why did they feel able to behave that way? And then finally, obviously, parenting and families. We've seen family breakdown, marriage in the decline, and that's really damaging for young people.
Can I just add one thing? I think the minute when any government brings in the celebrity, I think you realise then they're not serious. Because bringing Idris Elba in as, look what we've got, that's not serious. And that I always measure that. How big of the celebrity can they get? The politicians get to stand by them, and that they're not serious.
I think they'd be, if they actually had something concrete off the back, I think it would or could be serious. Because these guys are influencers, right? They do influence.
Yeah, but
it's the fact that they just do a photo shoot.
Yeah.
Well, just a question for anyone who wants to pick up, but particularly you, Tom. I just wanted to. There was a point made earlier about sentencing, and I was quite interested in, developing that further, because there's the argument that actually some people think that, throw away the key, regardless of the crime, and a lot of people think that actually, if you look at some of the writers that were mentioned, a lot of them did actually have 20, 30 previous convictions and in and out of prison, and so something's clearly going wrong there. Whereas you've talked about other forms of justice and so on as a way of preventing reoffending and certain types of behaviour. So what do you think about the sentencing question?
I think it really does depend on the crime and the context. But broadly speaking, a default towards wanting longer sentences to solve our problems of crime is just a fool's errand, I believe.
But that seems quite popular amongst when you ask.
I think there's a lot of things that I believe that are probably not popular. But I predominantly, there is some just belief and faith and trust. But predominantly, I'm going on the evidence. And there is a lot of evidence that longer sentences don't really serve as a deterrent. I would say there's some special cases, though. I mean, somebody I was speaking to across the road where I live, he's a road safety campaigner. And he is rightly furious at the way people drive around Birmingham in this case. And they drive around ridiculously, and it does make life really unpleasant, actually. It's, enough to make people move away. And he talked about a story where a guy, and it's published, it wasn't just rumour, he'd basically he'd permanently brain damaged a young child because he was driving on cocaine. And in this particular case, and I didn't follow the whole case, so maybe there's nuances, but he only got 3 years. And that doesn't feel right. But aside from these, emotional questions around serious crimes and does the sentence feel enough, I think it's the wrong area to focus. On the protests, I don't know enough about sentencing law as to whether I would give 20 years for certain things. But what I am glad in this particular case is that the UK said being a neo-Nazi and an extreme racist is really considered disgusting. I understand that a lot of people got pulled into that for complicated social reasons, and I do think we should talk about it, and I don't subscribe to just demonising groups. There's a reason why somebody's become a neo-Nazi, in my view, and it's probably a long journey of exploitation. But that sentencing was so visible to the country, it was sending a very clear message. The actual years, I don't know where I stand on that, but I'm glad it was met with something significant.
So we'll go back out to the floor. That you had your hand up before, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for the discussion. It's very interesting, and there are so many different angles to come at this from. But the one that I was thinking of addressing was it feels like a lot of this is downstream of lack of funding for the police. And the reason for that is it's forcing the police to make political decisions about what gets enforced and what doesn't get enforced. So the first is a sort of question / recommendation, which is when people criminalize new things, is there a process whereby resource gets allocated to the police and to the jail system to accommodate the extra demands that makes? And if not, perhaps that's something that should be done a bit more routinely. Maybe it is, I don't know. And the other is, right now, because of where we're at, we, in practice, have a lot of things that are de facto decriminalized. So bike theft is an obvious example, and I have a personal relationship with. Perhaps a program of active decriminalization would be a better way to go, where we sort of collectively decide to not enforce certain laws or redact them, rather than having a continuing process of lack of enforcement.
Thank you. Did anyone want to come back?
I'm happy to talk a bit about your question there about kind of the extent to which the system, the government, the agencies kind of model or in any way kind of consider the sort of the knock-on consequences of passing yet another law. I mean, there's certainly an exercise in which they will, look to assess the impact, and then they publish inevitably an impact assessment that is either sort of massively under the mark, massively over the mark, somewhere in the middle, probably fraught with all sorts of problematic language that generates some headlines and stuff. But so there is an impact assessment. I mean, the issue really is, was the legislation, and I think this speaks to some of your other points, I think. So, for instance, take theft of pets as an example, putting aside the question of animal sentience and all the rest of it, but just this issue of people having their dogs or cats or whatever, rabbits, whatever it might be, stolen, and obviously that's a hugely emotional issue. Political party of any persuasion would probably feel quite a lot of pressure to be seen to be doing something. It was already a criminal offence to steal, pets. It was a Theft Act offence, and so really, like, that legislation there'd have been an impact assessment, and I don't know what it said, I can't remember, but it would have probably said something along the lines of, well, it's already a crime, they probably do a bit more of it, so it might add a little bit to the prison estate, it might add a little bit to this, but nothing, no sort of grander theory, right? It's purely a very pragmatic and to an extent a very declinist sort of, oh, well, we'll just make it work kind of almost approach, I would say. No, obviously on some issues you do see resource more explicitly allocated, again, driven in part perhaps by political pressure. So I think it's kind of horses for courses to a degree. And then just to say, I think if you were to decriminalise or legalise, theft of bikes tomorrow, I suspect we would see an awful lot more. We wouldn't, of course, necessarily see as many headlines about it because we wouldn't have the data, because we wouldn't report it to anyone anymore. No, but just to work it through. So I think what you'd see is criminals would suddenly do more of it, because back to my earlier sort of point about the risks and the consequences, there wouldn't be any. And then inevitably we'd probably then see a massive campaign to recriminalise, a bit like we've seen in California, Oregon, and places where they've gone down that road on drugs, and now they're sort of reversing in many ways. And ultimately we might end up in a better place, right? We might end up actually with, bike theft with really nice, powerful laws and with specific sort of resource allocated. But the interim period would probably be a bit anarchic.
I don't mind that. I don't mind that. I do think that we are. It seems that the police, and it seems that they're always catching up. That whatever is that is political and fashionable at the moment, they're sort of catching up on that, and it does feel at the moment that some things are not decriminalised, but not taken seriously, and then other things are taken, absolutely seriously, and it really does depend on on the politics of the day. And that's not justice, actually. And that's what troubles me about this sort of catching up and chasing headlines or chasing politicians. It's not actually, there's no justice in any of that. And that really does worry me.
We'll go back out to Manira in the front.
Yeah, I had a question for Rory. You mentioned the youth justice system, and I know that the number of young people in custody has gone down quite dramatically, and this is often hailed as a success. If you read government reports in the last 10 years, it's gone down quite a bit. Just wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on a real issue. So, youth custody, forget the exact numbers, but ballpark, we used to have sort of 3.5, even 4,000 sort of young adolescents, often typically male, in custody. And then certainly over the 2010s, there was a real push to kind of avoid the use of custody for young people. And I haven't got the charts to show behind me, but broadly speaking, what you'd probably see, and I'm sure some fact checker somewhere will prove or disprove, but essentially that there is certainly, I think, a hypothesis to be put forward around the fact that as that has diminished, the youth custody population, you've got more young people who are in very, vulnerable, if we want to use that term, situations, whether it's being exploited or whether it's just that they've grown up in a very challenging environment and they haven't had the same support and love that we'd want every child to have, and they end up running around the streets with machetes and all the rest of it. And those young men, in particular young boys, basically are ticking time bombs. So back when Theresa May had her sort of knife crime summit, the Home Office had on one of their slides, they had a sort of point about trying to understand whether the reduction in youth custody was indeed a causative factor towards the rise in knife crime. And to my knowledge, they've never done it. It reminds me, I'll probably FOI it after this. But essentially, that is certainly something I would sort of argue for, that there are young people who we are allowing to escalate in their behaviour. And certainly in my own experience, there was a young boy who was caught with a knife. He'd already been kicked out by his family because he was bringing a lot of trouble to their door. They'd had enough of him. I got a hold of him, and I wanted, obviously, the youth justice system to kick in, right? I've done the hard work of identifying him, stopping and searching him, catching him with a knife, bringing him into custody, and all the rest of it. I've taken a lot of risk there. He could have rolled over and cut his femoral artery open on the knife, and then I'd be a white Met officer stood over a young black dead kid, and my life would be ruined, and never mind his. So for me, we really dropped the ball, and this comes back to a bit to the referral pathways point, right? That young person was referred into the youth justice system, was not held in custody, was sent off to a children's care home, who he immediately absconded from, funnily enough. And then I had to try and find him. Soon discovered through my local contacts, which I had through being a neighbourhood officer, that he'd obviously gone on a county line, back to the other point many of us have made, and he was down in one of the counties, and he was eventually picked up on a knife point rape. So, that for me is like just a concrete example. It's just one guy, but a concrete example of he should have been in a secure, safe environment where we could at least have had the hope of addressing some of the issues he had, but certainly at the very least kept him and the public safe.
But I would say in many of those cases, and it is heavily researched, it's not just kind of will and hope, there would have been, and I think we've agreed earlier, that there'd be a lot of missed opportunities. So it's not necessarily about some light touch response to a young person found with a serious blade, particularly if it's off lots of other records for things. It's about what do you do with them when you find them much earlier. And I'd say there's a couple of things. And I do appreciate some young people, their first offence is being found with a big knife. Although often in those cases, there's a real fear component and they're carrying it out of fear because of what's happening in their community rather than they're, one of the leaders of the organised activity going on. But there's some spectacular early intervention work that goes on in some schools across the country. Really high quality, again, very holistic, tackling multiple problems, undiagnosed learning needs and things, and giving help, sports, art, trying to reform actually what their education is, totally going to your point earlier, not just trying to force everybody through exactly the same educational route. I really agree with that. But on the slightly more serious youth crime, there is some really exciting police-led work which has been sponsored by the previous government. You know, I'm not the centre left, but there are quite a few things that the last government did that would have a lot of common ground. Probably the main difference is about the scale of which they did it. I'd like to see much more of it. Some of it was police-led work, again, working with lots of other community agencies on that young person's case, not in a breathing down their neck, being aggressive way, in a, we're here for you, we're not going to let you go back to that county lines because we know you're involved, and wrapping around that support. And it's not over in 1 week or 2 months or 3 months, because that's the length of time it needs to get somebody of that seriousness onto the right trajectory.
Can I just quickly, I suppose, just to quickly come back, because I, as you'd imagine, in Number 10 and elsewhere, I've heard an awful lot of people come to me with, oh, I've got this great programme, I've got this great intervention. And it's sort of like, well, if it was so great, why has knife crime gone up? Now, I'm not seeking to therefore pin the entire problem on one intervention as the solution. But for me, and certainly I think if we were to have a sort of sample of police officers or even probation workers, actually, I think what you'd find actually is often people feel like we sort of know maybe what the answers are, but we just need to grip some of these kids.
I'd say, probably without going on too long, austerity had rather a massive impact on removing a lot of the things that worked, including good quality community policing.
Although saying that, I did my PhD between 2005 and 2008, and it was in the end of the New Labour era. In fact, I handed it in 2010, and it was all about New Labour's policies of social exclusion, which was hateful, actually. And I thought, oh, is my research going to now be relevant? But actually, it is. But in Nottingham, where I come from, and St Anne's, which was a council estate that I lived on, we had a major problem in that area on gun crime. And that was before austerity. And that was about police corruption. It was about organised crime getting a hold of a particular area. And I remember there was a piece of research done by the Nottinghamshire Crime Commissioner and the University of Nottingham, and I was there. And I remember they'd done this big piece of research, and they'd found out that young people are more likely, they become arrested on police contact. So actually, you're more likely to be arrested through police contact than not. And so what they decided to do, and this shows you, this kind of really is an example of when people in the middle that aren't connected to those communities just make mad decisions based on research that's also not thorough. They decided that what needed to happen was the police needed to come into the schools and teach small children how to behave around the police. And it was about, when the police ask you for something, you must comply, because otherwise you might get arrested. And I remember listening to this, and I was sat in a community meeting, and there was a lot of families there that were very worried about their young people and their kids getting shot, because that was happening in the city. And they were like going, yeah, that's a good idea. We should teach our children to be subservient to the police. And I was just sat there thinking, no, that's not right. That's not the answer. So these issues they've been over many years. They've been over 30 and 40. It's not one particular government or one particular action. This has been happening for many, many years.
Before I just go back out, I just had a question, because I think it's been touched upon in different points. I mean, what role does the wider public have in all of this? Because some people feel like there is essentially a democratic crisis across institutions, where there is a sense of disconnection to people that make decisions. And does that contribute to a sense of a lack of empowerment to be able to act within your own community, to feel like you can trust other people, to feel like you'll have the backing to actually do something? Is wider society in retreat as well, because obviously it can't just solely be a policing matter, because police respond within a particular social context. So I don't know if there's any thoughts about kind of a broader, perhaps societal retreat, if that plays a role in any of this.
I mean, I feel like the last time maybe some people anyway talked about this was 1829 or thereabouts, when obviously the Met was created, and the sort of slightly mythical Pelian principles, and one of which is, the public are the police and the police are the public. And the difference is that the duties are on all of us, but the police are paid to give those duties a full-time kind of seeing to. And that's very appealing. It's arguably a bit romantic. But there's also a slight truth to it, to the points I think that have slightly come out around, the fact that actually communities do have some ability and agency to kind of police themselves. I think that's become increasingly challenging, particularly I think where, I was up in Cleveland a few years back, and there were some folk there who were telling me a really sad story of how their street, where everyone knew each other, was slowly but surely being turned into endless HMOs.
Yeah, that's
And then inevitably people were fleeing for the hills, as it were. And, you're left then with a street where, anything goes. And, old ladies on that street having stuff put through their letterbox, calling the police, but they live in a semi-rural community where obviously the police never quite get around to it because it's never quite serious enough. And at the same time, obviously, we've got issues in confidence, if you will, in the impartiality of the police. And I think people do have a fear that if they get involved, will I somehow be the one who ends up, in the dock? If I intervene in a shop theft or at the ticket barrier, if I start, grabbing hold of some 12-year-old to say, you should show him your ticket. So I think there is a real fear there. But I think it's a serious issue. I mean, for me, it comes back to this personal responsibility and individual agency that politicians just don't talk about. So politicians aren't even clear on what even they would do. Would Yvette Cooper wade in?
Dennis, did you want to come back before I go to
the kind of the withdrawing of the community sense. I think there's so many different factors which go into whether somebody succeeds in life or fails. You've got a lot of people who won Olympic medals who give a little mini speech about all the different people in their life that made them who they are. And likewise, those same kinds of networks of experiences occurred to when somebody might go into crime. And so actually, there is a huge number of people that necessarily are involved in betterment of somebody's life. Teachers, social workers, police, grassroots football clubs on a Sunday, you name it, there's loads of it. And in that sense, I think the community is part of it. I think helping leadership explaining what they think is the right answer doesn't mean people have to agree with it. But I think it's right that they put forward solutions about how to rebuild the community. And people will probably take some of it and not others. But I think just sitting back and not really commenting and being scared to comment about what the gaps are, which I don't think anyone here has done, but that I think is worse than saying something.
David, you in the back, had your hand up for a while.
This question is kind of addressed to Rory and Tom in particular. I'd like to know what you think the role of the police is. It's because over my life, we've been constantly getting scope creep. I've heard a lot about restorative justice, community cohesion. Is that cool? The police are leading initiatives that, I don't think is within the remit of the police. I think the police should just stop and solve crime. And I never hear in the media any clear KPIs on, police stopping crime. And are we sort of giving police leaders a free ride because crime is on the up and no one's taking accountability for it? Everything is outsourced to the community. It's this, it's that, no budget, but police aren't basically stopping criminals. Why not? I don't know.
Well, I don't think I was advocating that the police step in and do everything. And a lot of police leaders I've worked with over the last 7 years, they definitely don't want to do that. There are some examples where they have stepped in and probably done more than they should, like that one I was mentioning before about youth violence. But then the advantage of that was that they showed leadership about what they believed would work. And because a lot of people are looking to them to say, you need to stop this, it's your job to stop the crime, actually them getting involved in an initiative like this set a precedent that, this can be an effective way. They probably shouldn't be the ones to lead it all the way. And in fact, I didn't think it was them who should, but I'm still glad they did. And there is mission creep. And it kind of goes to the point you made earlier about just whacking out new laws. It's really funny that you mentioned the dog theft, because there was rising dog theft and there was worries in the West Midlands about it. So we asked the Chief Constable about it. But when that new law came in, we made a party political point about, but you've given us no extra resource to deal with it. So it is this constant live debate. And my general sense is mostly police do just want to stick to their core activities, particularly with things like sexual violence. I don't think there's many people that would disagree that the prosecution rates, they're just not where they want to be. It's actually a serious injustice, but most officers I know agree with that. And they would like to dedicate more resources to doing those really complex cases that are hard to prosecute and not being pushed into mission creep for the social cohesion stuff. They've got a role to play, but most of it should be picked up by other agencies and grassroots community, in my view. But it's really complicated. It depends, doesn't it, on areas and crime issues and all of that.
Quick.
Yeah, I mean, I would broadly agree with you completely on what is going awry and what they should be doing. So personally, yeah, I think it should be about preventing and detecting crime. Obviously, there's different ways that you can prevent crime. You could have the police go off and do youth clubs. Personally speaking, the police should be focusing on the things that only they have the power to do. So they're the only ones who, broadly speaking, they're the only ones who can come and stop and search you. They're the only ones who can come and break your door down. They're the only ones, broadly, obviously some exceptions, who put files to the CPS for prosecution. So for me, yeah, they should be focused on preventing and detecting crime through the powers that we've bestowed upon them, obviously through Parliament. And then just to, I suppose, as to why this mission creep, obviously the Equalities Act is part of the issue, the sort of gold plating of things like the public sector equality duty, misunderstanding of it. Then on top of all of that, I think you've got a bigger question too about multiculturalism, actually. And I think policing, we've never, back to my point about 1829, those Pelian principles were kind of drafted, and they might still be fit for purpose, but they've never really been re-examined through the lens of a multicultural, multi-ethnic Britain. And so I think there's an awful lot, I think, of intellectual heavy lifting to be done, and hopefully we can do it through forums like this to kind of figure out actually how do we get the police back on track. And then a final point, I suppose I'd throw in, how might we fix it in the immediate term? I mean, if Bill Bratton was available, I'd probably bring him over and have him implement CompStat, right? So that we could actually see what crime is happening on our doorstep, what is actually getting solved and it isn't being solved, and expose some of the back office stuff that is really important, but we don't see. So a lot of the sexual offences, a lot of the safeguarding stuff. So so I agree with you. I think there's a way out of it. But they're, as you say, they're quite wedded to their current approach.
We don't have lots of time, so short answers, and I'll take a few questions. But before, just to bring you in, Andrew, I mean, do you have is there any example where, like, technology or artificial intelligence or anything of that nature has actually been genuinely transformative that you're aware of in terms of actually solving crime, detecting crime, preventing it?
So, yes, certainly. So there's an organisation that was actually set up here in London called Sequester. So they developed a technology that could, pretty much to your point, identify or it would be aware of the identity of a particular individual. So if there was a particular crime that had been committed, all CCTV between particular periods across a whole city or between particular points could be searched to help increase efficiency with a police investigation. And it's been hugely useful in multiple countries to find particularly heinous crimes. So it's been rolled out in the US, it's been rolled out in Australia. It's been a particular success story.
And here?
I don't think it has been deployed over here. But certainly artificial intelligence can not just be used to detect people's faces. You can identify people through their gait, so how they walk. If people have taken more than 10 or 20 strides, as an example, they can be detected in that particular way. So there's certainly a strong potential for technology to be applied in areas that it hasn't.
Is there much appetite for that in your experience amongst in the government or in the councils? Is it something that's being really embraced, or is it?
So from our experience, where going to some of the earlier points where, let's say, littering as an example, new powers have been what's the word I'm looking for?
Granted or
become on statute books. The penalties have been increased threefold, but they've not been adopted simply because it's not a large priority. So I think it is difficult. I think it does take funding. From a DEFRA point of view, they provide £1 million a year to tackle fly tipping and to tackle littering, keep Britain tidy. They have millions of pounds a year for chewing gum task force, but the money just keeps on getting spent every year. So does it really change people's behaviour? Sadly not, I don't think.
So we'll just take, a last few points. There's a few different people that have their hand up. So you can over here, and then we'll go.
Hi there. Yeah, just a very brief idea which came to me, which may be nonsense, but I especially wanted to ask Rory. I know a lot of experienced older police have left the force. Would it just make sense to say, can you come back?
We'll just take a few. That gentleman had their hand up.
Love the panel's view on whether body cam footage is a sort of net positive for perceptions in policing or not.
Well, that's interesting. And then finally,
polls consistently show most people want higher sentences. Police don't deal with loads of crimes that people would want dealt with, and fare evasion is a good example, mostly because they're incredibly busy doing other more important things or less important things, which I won't get into. Why is politics not responsive to that kind of, I think, fairly broad consensus, and what can we do to make it more responsive?
okay, so
Can I just?
older police officers, should they be brought back? There's a few different
Yeah,
questions, so feel free to pick up.
So it doesn't matter what technology we've got, and it kind of that does answer some of your question. It's what we've decided is a crime before that. So it doesn't matter what and one of the issues we have with women and crime against women is that, I'm going to say something now and people are going to go, oh no, don't say this, but women are not valued in our society. So unless we value people, or unless it doesn't matter what technology we've got, because someone else is going to decide what the crime is. And I'm going to give you a really quick example of this, and it's also not the police's job to go to court, to take something to court. It's the CPS. So I was arrested, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I was protesting against a building in East London. One side of it was social housing, the other side of it was private housing. Social housing people had to go through the back door. Private housing went through the front door, and I was protesting this. And I was arrested for putting a sticker on a window. And I was arrested. The CPS had looked at it, said, yeah, it can go. This is for putting a sticker on a window, and a hate crime as well, for being hateful towards people who lived in a private block. And then when the police actually looked at the CCTV, they found out that I hadn't put the sticker on the window. It wasn't me. So what do you think they did? And it was the CPS that made this decision. Did they drop that case? No, I got done for joint enterprise. That I had put a sticker on a window with someone that I may not have known. And I had to go to court for joint enterprise. So again, it doesn't matter what we put in place as to prevent crime. It's actually the people who sit behind who decide whether this is crime or not. And, at some point somebody said, yeah, this woman stood outside this building. She may not have known the person who put a sticker on the window, but we're going to do it for joint enterprise. And it was just an absolute waste, but it was a political arrest, and the CPS had taken that through. And when I went to court, the judge actually asked the CPS and said, why have you done this? So it's not actually the police that do that bit, it's someone else. Yeah, I was found not guilty. I was found not guilty on all charges because it was ridiculous.
Not the first time a judge has said, why is this in front of us? I'll try and do a rapid fire. So it's a good point. You could say the same about prison officers. You could say the same about other kind of areas where we've hemorrhaged experience. I think the issue is whether people would want to come back. how attractive, and I don't just mean sort of in financial terms, I just mean in terms of, you know, quality of life, honestly, what proposition is going to get people back and retain people going forward. So I think a question that is about more than just, can we just get them back? I think we'd have to need them to come back, to want to come back. On body-worn video, I think it's fascinating just to look at the US as an example, where the police departments there use the body-worn footage much more sort of proactively and much more transparently with the public. So in the aftermath of an officer-involved shooting or some sort of critical incident, they'll pull together the 999 or the 911 call transcript to explain why were officers in a situation. They'll have the CCTV footage showing what happened. They'll have the body-worn video, and they'll offer a factual narration with making the point very strongly that obviously an investigation's ongoing and things may change, but this is what we know. And obviously we do none of that here. And so, you know, we pay an increasing amount of money actually to store mountains and mountains of body-worn video in the cloud, and we do very little with it other than use it in prosecutions. And so for me, I'd like us to, in terms of your point, so I think at the moment I mean, it's probably a bit marginal at the moment. I think we're nowhere near making the most of it. And obviously there's a role for AI too, in terms of analysing kind of the footage that we do capture and obviously making links that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And then the final question as to why politically it doesn't translate the public's attitudes. I mean, I would bash the Treasury, wouldn't I? I do think the Treasury view the criminal justice system and policing as a bit of a cost centre that is there to be sort of minimised and starved. I think they have a quite short-term outlook, and so they sort of slightly forget, I think, the sort of the original, if you will, austerity, and they therefore kind of go, well, you've had 2 or 3 good years, so what are you moaning about? Be grateful for what you've got, sort of thing. And then I think there's also obviously a permanent lobby campaigning kind of voice endlessly going at everyone saying prison doesn't work, police don't do anything, they criminalise everyone, it's all very bad. And that just encourages, I think, and of course the spending teams in the Treasury often, the public's sort of spending teams, are often some of the youngest civil, and that's nothing against young people, but you know, some of the youngest, obviously back to issues of class as well. Maybe they've never experienced crime in the sense that some do. And so for me, I probably would lay a lot of blame at the Treasury and more broadly, I think the political elites, who I do think are just out of touch on crime broadly.
Any last kind of closing thoughts, round up? Do you want to, Andrew?
I'll go super quick.
Yeah.
Body-worn camera, on balance, I think it's been a good thing. I think it's protected officers who have done the right thing. I think it's helped flag officers who aren't doing as well as they should. And I know in the West Midlands Police, not perfect by a long way, but they made a lot of effort in reviewing a large amount of that to improve standards of policing in a constructive, helpful way. At least that's the commitment. AI and technology, I think we definitely should be exploring it across all sectors. But I think we should put ethics at the heart of the discussion, not as a barrier, but to make it be what we need it to be and want it to be. And you have to be really inclusive of who gets to participate in that conversation. Otherwise, it's just barging it through, really. And then, I think the bottom line is with policing, in terms of it being a palatable career, people are leaving in droves. I think statistically the rate isn't that much higher than it's been for quite a long time, but the pay isn't high enough. And just like with the NHS and nurses and doctors and burnout, I saw that very acutely with the police. And I think the bottom line is, if we want the police to function well and improve, we've got to give them better standards. Otherwise it will be an ongoing fight.
Thank you. And just any closing thoughts about tech?
I think certainly we've been approached as an organisation in regards to what body-worn video can do. There are organisations that provide civil enforcement for local authorities, and they have thousands of individuals who wear body-worn video, and saying, could we create technology that would help them add value for local authorities? So to your point, there's massive amounts of video that's there. I think from a public's perspective, they'd have to recognise that if this video can be used for other reasons, they should have the ability to opt in. And you know, what is of importance to the public, who owns that data, and what really have an open debate that's transparent before it gets used and laws are passed.
Okay, well, thank you to our panel. Can we? There's lots more wine and drinks and other things there, so please feel free to have a drink and continue the discussion.